In the frozen dawn of the north, where the sea boiled with mist and the mountains hid the gods, the Vikings rose from their wooden halls not as men, but as vessels of faith forged in blood. Pain, to them, was not merely the byproduct of violence. It was the very language of existence. Every scar was a prayer, every scream a confession, every death a doorway. In this world, where life was brief and the afterlife infinite, the body was only a bridge between honor and eternity. This was not a civilization obsessed with cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a people who believed that to suffer beautifully was to please the gods themselves. To understand the depravity of Viking tortures, one must first understand the faith that wrapped around their souls like frost. The Norsemen lived not for peace, but for legacy, and legacy could only be born in blood. The Vikings believed their fates were carved by unseen hands, their deaths preordained by the Norns, the weavers of destiny. Dying with courage ensured entry to Valhalla, the hall of the slain, while dying as a coward condemned one's spirit to eternal obscurity. In this grim arithmetic of faith, pain became proof and suffering became sanctity. The fires that burned in their longhouses were not simply for warmth. They were reminders of the flames that forged warriors. The songs they sang before battle were not merely war cries. They were invocations to Odin, the god who hung from the world tree for 9 nights, pierced and starving, to learn the secrets of the runes. When a Viking tortured or was tortured, it was not just human violence. It was divine imitation. Pain was a form of worship, the sacred theater of endurance where flesh became a script written in blood and faith. In this world, the line between devotion and depravity blurred into a single, terrifying truth. The more one could endure, the closer one was to godhood. The Vikings did not view torture as a moral violation. It was, instead, a test of spiritual strength. When a captive screamed beneath the blade, it was not only his body that was being tested, but his soul. If he died with dignity, refusing to beg, he earned admiration, even from his executioners. There was a grim respect among them, a shared understanding that pain was the price of transcendence. The land itself seemed to demand this philosophy. The North was a place of relentless extremes. Endless winter nights, brutal seas, and the ever-present threat of starvation. To survive in such a world required a heart that could not break, only harden. The Vikings internalized this cruelty. They saw it in the ice, in the storms, in the very breath of the gods. Their tortures reflected nature's indifference, slow, merciless, and awe-inspiring in its cold precision. When they flayed, drowned, or bled a man, they were not merely punishing him. They were reenacting the raw truth of existence itself. That pain is the only constant in life and the ultimate proof of worth. But beneath this divine brutality, there was beauty, a strange, haunting poetry to the way they understood suffering. The act of pain became a mirror for the human condition. In their myths, gods suffered so that mortals might understand wisdom. In their rituals, mortals suffered to please gods who, in turn, bled and wept for cosmic knowledge. The cycle was eternal. The pain of one life echoed through generations, whispered by skalds around firelight, immortalized in sagas that made agony eternal. This first glimpse into the Viking soul reveals a civilization that feared nothing, not death, not agony, not divine judgment. They looked upon torture not as the end of life, but as a ceremony of truth, a final confession written in flesh. Before we descend into the specific horrors that define their punishments, we must remember, to the Vikings, torment was not madness. It was meaning. It was faith made visible. And in the screams of the dying, they believed they could hear the gods themselves, listening. The Viking world was not a land of chaos. Beneath its storms of violence lay a strange and unwavering order, a system where every drop of blood spilled was accounted for by divine and human law alike. To live among the Norse was to exist under the shadow of Drengskap, the sacred code of honor that governed every breath, every oath, every blade unsheathed. The Viking did not belong to a nation, but to a moral universe defined by courage, loyalty, and reputation. Within this framework, justice was not merely a human concern. It was a sacred act, overseen by gods who demanded balance through blood. At the center of Viking justice stood the Thing, the assembly where chieftains, warriors, and free men gathered to speak the law. It was both parliament and battlefield, courtroom and shrine. There, beneath open skies, disputes were settled, punishments decreed, and fates sealed. But unlike modern justice, the Viking version did not seek peace. It sought equilibrium. To restore harmony to the world, pain had to be answered with pain. A life taken unjustly could only be redeemed through another life, or through the spilling of sufficient blood to satisfy both kin and gods. Even compensation, wergild, the man price, was a form of bloodless vengeance, a way of quantifying worth and loss. The Thing had no executioners. Punishment was not institutional, it was personal. If a man was condemned, his accuser or his kin carried out the sentence. In that act, the boundaries between justice and vengeance dissolved. To execute the guilty was not cruelty, it was duty. The gods looked upon the act as fulfillment of cosmic order. Even when the punishments were savage, mutilation, burning, or flaying, they were never meant to be random. Each pain inflicted carried symbolic weight. Each wound restored balance between the living and the dead, the righteous and the damned. One of the most feared fates was Utligger, outlawry. To be declared an outlaw was to be erased from humanity itself. The condemned lost all rights, all protection, and could be killed by anyone without consequence. In the sagas, outlawry is described as a living death, a sentence more terrifying than the axe or the rope. The outlaw wandered the wilderness like a ghost, shunned by kin, hunted like a beast. Many chose suicide rather than face the slow annihilation of being forgotten. In Viking eyes, outlawry was a punishment that attacked the soul rather than the body. It shattered identity, stripping a man of his name, which to them was immortality. There were lesser punishments too, though none were mild. Thieves might have their hands severed or their backs branded with runes marking shame. Liars could have their tongues cut or be forced into humiliating rituals before the community. A murderer who killed without honor might be stoned to death or impaled, his corpse displayed for crows as a warning to others. These public spectacles of punishment served not only as deterrents, but as offerings. In their world, the spectacle of pain reaffirmed moral order. The crowd was not entertained, they were reminded. Yet what made Viking justice unique was its spiritual foundation. The Norse believed that the gods themselves practiced justice through suffering. Odin punished betrayal. Thor avenged insult. Loki's own punishment, bound in chains beneath dripping venom, was the divine mirror of mortal law. In this way, human torture became a reflection of divine justice. When a man was punished, it was not only to restore social order, but to echo the pain of the gods who watched over them. Every stroke of the blade, every scream beneath the execution post, resonated with cosmic symbolism. Even the way trials were decided had ritualistic depth. Oath-taking was sacred, and to break an oath was to invite ruin. Sometimes, when words failed, the Vikings turned to trial by ordeal. A man might grasp red-hot iron, plunge his hand into boiling water, or walk across fire. If the gods found him innocent, his wounds would heal cleanly. If not, infection would reveal his guilt. It was a brutal logic, faith tested through agony, truth measured by how much pain the flesh could withstand. This fusion of spirituality and punishment created a culture where cruelty was normalized but never senseless. To modern eyes, it was barbaric. To them, it was divine equilibrium. Their justice was not about rehabilitation but revelation. Pain revealed who a man truly was: coward or warrior, liar or truth-bearer, cursed or chosen. The Vikings believed that by enduring torment, even the condemned could reclaim a measure of honor if he faced his punishment without fear. In this world of sacred violence, every act of torture was a negotiation with the divine. Blood was language, agony was grammar. The gods listened not to prayers whispered in temples, but to the cries of the judged. And those cries, echoing through icy valleys and storm-racked seas, told the oldest story of all, that justice, in its purest and darkest form, demands not forgiveness, but suffering. The blood eagle. Few words in the annals of human cruelty strike such a haunting chord. For centuries, scholars, poets, and priests have whispered its name with disbelief, calling it the ultimate ritual of terror, the act that turned men into myths. But to the Vikings who conceived it, the blood eagle was not merely execution, it was transcendence. It was vengeance shaped into ceremony, a message written in living flesh to both mortals and gods. In this ritual, agony became art, and death a declaration. The stories of the blood eagle begin, as all Viking truths do, somewhere between history and legend. The sagas speak of noblemen and kings, traitors and oath breakers, who met their end beneath the edge of an executioner's blade. Among them was Aella, king of Northumbria, whose betrayal of the Norse warrior Ragnar Lothbrok sealed his fate. When Ragnar's sons captured him, they did not simply kill him. They performed the blood eagle upon his body, offering his soul to Odin in the most sacred and horrifying way imaginable. Yet the truth, buried beneath centuries of poetry and religious bias, remains blurred. Was it real, or was it myth? The power of the blood eagle lies in that uncertainty. It could have happened, and that is enough to make it eternal. The ritual itself, as described in the old texts, was an act of chilling precision. The condemned was laid face down, bound so that movement was impossible, his arms stretched outward like a supplicant before the gods. The executioner then used a seax, a short Viking blade, to slice open the back along the spine. Rib by rib, the bones were pried apart, the chest cavity opened like a grotesque pair of wings. The lungs were drawn out through the wounds and spread over the shoulders, fluttering faintly in the cold air. To those who witnessed, it appeared as though the victim had sprouted wings, bloody, divine, and silent. Thus, the name, the blood eagle. But this was no mindless butchery. The blood eagle was a language, a statement of cosmic justice. To carve the eagle was to dedicate the victim's suffering to Odin himself, the god of war and wisdom, who demanded both sacrifice and spectacle. The condemned man's screams were believed to please the All-Father, his last breaths carried upward as offerings. In the Norse worldview, death was not an ending, it was a journey. And the blood eagle, as horrific as it was, served as a bridge between this life and the next. If performed correctly, if the victim did not cry out in cowardice, it could even cleanse his soul. The ritual also carried deep symbolic meaning tied to vengeance. The eagle was Odin's bird, the devourer of the slain, the omen of divine wrath. To mark a man with the eagle was to brand him as one who had betrayed the sacred order. His body became the canvas on which divine justice was written. The wings of flesh symbolized both retribution and release, the transformation of a traitor's soul through agony into the next realm. To the Vikings, such suffering was not simply deserved, it was necessary. Whether the ritual was performed as literally as the sagas describe has long been debated by historians. Some believe it was metaphorical, a poetic expression of gruesome death on the battlefield. Others, however, argue that the Norse were fully capable of such ritual precision. Archaeological evidence of mutilated remains, with ribs pried open post-mortem, suggests the possibility that at least some form of the blood eagle was practiced. And even if the full ritual was rare, its existence in the collective imagination was powerful enough to terrify generations. It was more than torture. It was mythology embodied in flesh. To imagine the scene is to glimpse the Viking soul at its most raw. Picture a fjord at twilight, torches flickering against the mist, warriors chanting low hymns to Odin. The condemned kneels before them, his fate already written by his own betrayal. As the blade bites, the chants rise in rhythm with his screams. The ritual is not done in haste. It is deliberate, sacred, a choreography of agony. Each rib split is a verse in a hymn of vengeance. The onlookers do not jeer. They watch in reverent silence, believing that through this death, order is restored. And yet, the horror of the blood eagle lies not only in its violence, but in its serenity. There is no frenzy, no madness. The executioner moves with the calm of a priest performing a sacrifice. The victim's suffering becomes transcendental, his agony a bridge between mortal and divine. The Vikings believed that through the ritual, they were not desecrating the body. They were releasing the soul, allowing it to fly to the gods. The flesh was only the vessel, the pain, the key. There is a deeper psychology at play here, one that reveals the Viking obsession with transforming terror into meaning. In the Blood Eagle, we see a civilization that refused to see pain as wasteful. Every cry, every breath, every drop of blood served a purpose. For them, suffering was sacred currency, exchanged for glory, revenge, and remembrance. The condemned man's body became a story, one that warriors would carry in song and saga, proof that the gods still watched and still demanded sacrifice. Over time, the blood eagle transcended its ritual roots and became a mythic warning. It was a reminder of what awaited those who broke oaths or defied divine order. It shaped the Viking sense of fear and reverence, embedding itself deep into their collective soul. Even centuries after Christianity replaced the old gods, the memory of the blood eagle lingered, a dark echo of the old faith, too vivid to be erased, too symbolic to be forgotten. When the sagas were finally written, Christian scribes may have exaggerated its cruelty to depict the pagans as beasts, but the truth is far more haunting. The Vikings did not see the blood eagle as cruelty. They saw it as justice, balance, and redemption through horror. The act that to us feels monstrous was, in their eyes, a sacred restoration of order. It was proof that the gods still demanded blood, and that mortals were willing to give it. The blood eagle stands as the ultimate embodiment of Viking faith, that the body is a temporary shell, but honor is eternal. To die screaming beneath the Sikhs was not merely to perish. It was to become a message, carved into the fabric of legend. And in those final gasps, as the wings of flesh opened toward the heavens, the Vikings believed the soul took flight, not in peace, but in glory. In the Viking world, pain was not reserved only for the enemy. It was also the punishment for betrayal, cowardice, and the breaking of sacred bonds. To the Norse mind, there was no crime greater than fear. A warrior's worth was measured not by how many battles he survived, but by how he faced death when it finally came. To live without honor was to live as nothing. And so, when a man failed his kin or his chieftain, when he fled the shield wall or refused to draw his sword, his punishment was designed not to destroy his body first, but his soul. Among the Norse, the word Ningur carried a venom beyond any curse. It meant coward, oath breaker, the dishonored one. To be called Ningur was to be stripped of your humanity. It was a social death, a sentence that cut deeper than any blade. The Vikings believed that a man's reputation was his immortality, his entry into saga and song. Once that was taken, he was worse than dead. He was forgotten. The punishments for such dishonor reflected this belief. They were not designed to kill swiftly, but to erase identity, to make the condemned live as something less than human. In some accounts, the coward was branded with runes of shame, marks burned into his skin to warn others of his moral rot. These brands could take the shape of serpents or wolves, symbols of betrayal and cowardice. Others were forced to crawl before their kin, stripped naked, mocked, and spat upon. The humiliation was ritualized. The people did not simply hate the coward. They purified themselves through his degradation. To witness his shame was to reaffirm their own courage, to remind the gods that fear still had a price. Exile was another punishment, perhaps more feared than death. A man declared Ninger was cast out into the wild, condemned to survive without the protection of tribe or law. The fjords and forests became his prison. In this exile, the elements became executioners. Hunger, frost, and isolation tore at the body and mind until death came as mercy. Some outlaws went mad, living like animals, their names forbidden to be spoken. Others sought redemption by embracing their fate, wandering until death found them. The sagas speak of such men as ghosts long before their hearts stopped beating. In certain regions, the punishment went further still. The coward might be subjected to the mock death, a ritual in which he was symbolically buried alive. His community gathered as if for a funeral, chanting his name not in honor but in disgust. He was laid into a shallow grave, covered with soil up to his chest, and left to crawl out on his own. The act symbolized the death of his honor and rebirth into shame. From that moment, he was dead in spirit. No man could share mead with him. No woman could lie with him. No warrior could fight beside him. To exist after such a punishment was to live as a walking corpse. Physical mutilation also played its part in the punishment of cowards. The cutting off of ears or noses, the breaking of limbs, and castration were all tools used to mark the dishonored. To mutilate the body was to reflect the deformity of the soul. In Viking society, where the physical form symbolized inner virtue, disfigurement was a visible reminder of disgrace. The mutilated man became a living warning, proof that cowardice was not a sin one could hide. But perhaps the cruelest punishment of all was social silence. Once a man was labeled Ninger, even his family could not speak his name without inviting shame. His possessions were destroyed or divided among others. His seat at the hearth was taken away. In the eyes of the gods and men alike, he ceased to exist. The sagas describe this as a soul death, a fate believed to be worse than any physical torment. The Vikings feared oblivion more than pain. For them, suffering was temporary, but to be forgotten was eternal. There were also forms of psychological torture that attacked what the Vikings valued most: their masculinity and honor. Some offenders were forced to wear women's clothing, an act that was not merely humiliation but spiritual castration. The Vikings believed gender carried divine essence. Odin's warriors were men of action. Women were keepers of magic and birth. To blur these roles was blasphemy. Dressing a coward in female garb was a way of severing his identity from both man and warrior, making him a creature without place in the cosmic order. And yet, even in their cruelty, the Vikings offered a twisted path to redemption. A man could attempt to reclaim his honor through acts of impossible courage. Some sought death in battle, charging into hopeless fights to prove to the gods that fear no longer ruled them. Others willingly submitted to torture or ritual suicide. There are accounts of shamed warriors plunging their blades into their own chests, offering their blood to Odin as an apology for cowardice. In this way, pain became penance. Through agony, they sought to wash away disgrace. These punishments reveal a profound truth about the Viking psyche. To them, death was not the opposite of life. Shame was. To die bravely was to ascend to eternal glory. To live without courage was to descend into a personal hell, a place of endless humiliation and darkness. Their tortures of the coward were not senseless. They were moral engineering, shaping their society through fear and reverence. Pain was not the ultimate punishment. Loss of honor was. In every corner of the Viking world, this belief echoed like a heartbeat. From the smallest village to the grandest longhouse, men told stories of those who had fallen from grace, their names whispered with disgust and pity. The purpose was clear. Courage was not optional. It was the foundation of existence. The gods themselves demanded bravery, and to deny that demand was to deny the divine. Thus, the tortures of the coward served as grim lessons. They reminded every warrior that fear could destroy more than flesh. It could annihilate the very idea of self. And in that knowledge lay the deepest cruelty of all, that in the Viking world, mercy was not found in survival, but in a death faced without trembling. In a Viking world, the line between reverence and fear of women was razor thin. The Norse worshipped goddesses of war and wisdom, Freya, Frigg, Skadi. Yet in the same breath, they condemned mortal women who dared to step beyond their prescribed place. Female power was both sacred and dangerous, divine and damned. And when a woman defied that fragile balance, through lust, betrayal, or forbidden knowledge, the punishments she faced were designed not merely to kill her body, but to erase the very idea of her power. The Viking world feared a woman who could not be controlled, and so it made her suffering into a warning carved into memory. To the Norse, womanhood was bound by duality. She was both the giver of life and the vessel of destruction, capable of bringing kings to ruin or warriors to their knees. Within the walls of the longhouse, she was expected to be loyal, fertile, and silent. But beyond those walls existed a different kind of woman, the vulva or psychona, the seeress who communed with spirits and fate itself. These women practiced seer, a forbidden form of magic said to manipulate destiny and invade the will of others. Even Odin, the All-Father, was said to have practiced it, but his doing so was considered shameful, for seer was the magic of women. To wield it was to blur the sacred boundary between masculine and feminine power, between order and chaos. When a woman was accused of practicing seer or consorting with dark forces, her fate was sealed long before any trial. The punishment was ritualistic and public, a theater of pain meant to cleanse the community. Some were hanged or drowned in icy waters, their bodies left to drift as offerings to the sea gods. Others were burned alive, their ashes scattered to prevent resurrection. The flames, the Vikings believed, purified the unholy. It was not mere execution, it was exorcism. The woman's screams were thought to drive away the spirits she had summoned, her death restoring order to the world she had defiled. Infidelity, too, was treated with savage severity. While men could take multiple lovers or wives, a woman's body was considered sacred property of her husband and family line. A wife accused of adultery risked punishments that blended cruelty with symbolic precision. She might be tied naked to a post in the center of the village while her husband struck the first blow. In some accounts, unfaithful wives were buried alive or cast into swamps, places of silence and decay, symbolic of moral rot. The message was clear. Her body had betrayed her husband, and so her body must be erased. There are tales from Icelandic sagas of women accused of witchcraft or adultery who were tortured not only physically, but spiritually. Some were forced to drink animal blood or eat the hearts of beasts in front of their accusers, mocking their supposed communion with dark powers. Others had their hair, considered the seat of feminine strength, cut and burned before death. This stripping of identity was more than humiliation, it was annihilation. In Viking belief, the body and soul were intertwined through symbols, hair, blood, and name, and to destroy these was to erase a person's essence. The sexual punishments inflicted upon women reveal the deepest anxieties of Viking society. A woman's body was both sacred and feared. To control, it was to control fate itself. There are fragmented accounts, half myth, half warning, of women publicly violated as a form of divine punishment. In some ritualized executions, the condemned was bound to a wooden frame shaped like a fertility symbol, her body exposed to the cold, her skin carved with runes of shame. The act was framed not as cruelty, but as purification, a return of corrupted flesh to the gods. The community participated not as spectators, but as penitents, watching the destruction of one who had brought disorder to the hearth. Yet, paradoxically, some women wielded immense power even within this world of control. The vulva, though feared, was also revered. Villages would seek her guidance before war, or ask her to summon visions of the future. She walked the edge between worship and damnation, between divine wisdom and death sentence. When such a woman was finally condemned, her punishment carried an almost religious intensity. The Vikings believed that destroying a vulva was an act of sacrifice, a necessary cleansing of a force too powerful for mortals. Her death, then, was not just execution, it was ritual balance, blood for knowledge. The cruelty toward women in this world reveals a truth the Vikings themselves may never have admitted aloud. They feared the power of creation. A woman could give life, and that made her dangerous. Her sexuality, her capacity to love or betray, could alter the destiny of men and clans. The tortures inflicted upon her were designed to reclaim dominance, to remind all that the gods were male, that authority flowed through the spear, not the womb. But beneath their punishments lay awe, a trembling recognition that woman was closer to the gods than any warrior could ever be. One saga tells of a widow accused of poisoning her husband, a nobleman. Rather than execution, she was forced to attend his funeral chained to his corpse for 3 days and nights. The symbolism is chilling. Her body bound to the one she had betrayed, her every breath steeped in decay. By the time the chains were removed, madness had claimed her. She wandered the coastlines, speaking to ghosts until her death. To the Vikings, this was justice, a punishment that let her soul decay before her flesh did. Even mercy, when offered, carried the mark of cruelty. Some women were allowed to take their own lives rather than face public execution. To die by one's own hand was seen as an act of courage, preserving a shred of dignity in the eyes of the gods. But even in death, their bodies were rarely buried with honor. The graves of executed women were shallow, their names left unspoken, their memory swallowed by earth and snow. Oblivion was the final punishment, complete erasure from the songs and sagas that gave immortality. And yet, echoes of these women survived. In the sagas, in the old poems, their names flicker briefly like embers in the dark. Mistresses of forbidden power, bearers of knowledge that terrified men. Their suffering became myth, their deaths transformed into moral lessons whispered across generations. The Vikings believed they had silenced them, but in truth, they had made them immortal. The story of Viking women's punishment is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a reflection of humanity's oldest fear, the fear of the feminine divine. The Norse gods themselves could not escape this fear, for even Odin bowed to the wisdom of the vulva, seeking from her the secrets of fate. And so, in their attempt to destroy these women, the Vikings were really waging war against their own gods, their own origins, their own awe of creation. Through fire, water, rope, and blade, they sought to tame what could not be tamed. And in doing so, They revealed something eternal about themselves, that the true terror of the North was not the axe or the sea, but the woman who dared to wield the power of life in a world that worshipped death. In the Viking world, the line between reverence and fear of women was razor thin. The Norse worshipped goddesses of war and wisdom, Freya, Frigg, Skadi. Yet in the same breath, they condemned mortal women who dared to step beyond their prescribed place. Female power was both sacred and dangerous, divine and damned. And when a woman defied that fragile balance, through lust, betrayal, or forbidden knowledge, the punishments she faced were designed not merely to kill her body, but to erase the very idea of her power. The Viking world feared a woman who could not be controlled, and so it made her suffering into a warning carved into memory. To the Norse, womanhood was bound by duality. She was both the giver of life and the vessel of destruction, capable of bringing kings to ruin or warriors to their knees. Within the walls of the longhouse, she was expected to be loyal, fertile, and silent. But beyond those walls existed a different kind of woman, the vulva or psychona, the seeress who communed with spirits and fate itself. These women practiced seer, a forbidden form of magic said to manipulate destiny and invade the will of others. Even Odin, the All-Father, was said to have practiced it, but his doing so was considered shameful, for seer was the magic of women. To wield it was to blur the sacred boundary between masculine and feminine power, between order and chaos. When a woman was accused of practicing seer or consorting with dark forces, her fate was sealed long before any trial. The punishment was ritualistic and public, a theater of pain meant to cleanse the community. Some were hanged or drowned in icy waters, their bodies left to drift as offerings to the sea gods. Others were burned alive, their ashes scattered to prevent resurrection. The flames, the Vikings believed, purified the unholy. It was not mere execution, it was exorcism. The woman's screams were thought to drive away the spirits she had summoned, her death restoring order to the world she had defiled. Infidelity, too, was treated with savage severity. While men could take multiple lovers or wives, a woman's body was considered sacred property of her husband and family line. A wife accused of adultery risked punishments that blended cruelty with symbolic precision. She might be tied naked to a post in the center of the village while her husband struck the first blow. In some accounts, unfaithful wives were buried alive or cast into swamps, places of silence and decay, symbolic of moral rot. The message was clear: her body had betrayed her husband, and so her body must be erased. There are tales from Icelandic sagas of women accused of witchcraft or adultery who were tortured not only physically, but spiritually. Some were forced to drink animal blood or eat the hearts of beasts in front of their accusers, mocking their supposed communion with dark powers. Others had their hair, considered the seat of feminine strength, cut and burned before death. This stripping of identity was more than humiliation, it was annihilation. In Viking belief, the body and soul were intertwined through symbols, hair, blood, and name, and to destroy these was to erase a person's essence. The sexual punishments inflicted upon women reveal the deepest anxieties of Viking society. A woman's body was both sacred and feared. To control, it was to control fate itself. There are fragmented accounts, half myth, half warning, of women publicly violated as a form of divine punishment. In some ritualized executions, the condemned was bound to a wooden frame shaped like a fertility symbol, her body exposed to the cold, her skin carved with runes of shame. The act was framed not as cruelty, but as purification, a return of corrupted flesh to the gods. The community participated not as spectators, but as penitents, watching the destruction of one who had brought disorder to the hearth. Yet, paradoxically, some women wielded immense power even within this world of control. The vulva, though feared, was also revered. Villages would seek her guidance before war or ask her to summon visions of the future. She walked the edge between worship and damnation, between divine wisdom and death sentence. When such a woman was finally condemned, her punishment carried an almost religious intensity. The Vikings believed that destroying a vulva was an act of sacrifice, a necessary cleansing of a force too powerful for mortals. Her death, then, was not just execution. It was ritual balance, blood for knowledge. The cruelty toward women in this world reveals a truth the Vikings themselves may never have admitted aloud. They feared the power of creation. A woman could give life, and that made her dangerous. Her sexuality, her capacity to love or betray, could alter the destiny of men and clans. The tortures inflicted upon her were designed to reclaim dominance, to remind all that the gods were male, that authority flowed through the spear, not the womb. But beneath their punishments lay awe, a trembling recognition that woman was closer to the gods than any warrior could ever be. One saga tells of a widow accused of poisoning her husband, a nobleman. Rather than execution, she was forced to attend his funeral chained to his corpse for 3 days and nights. The symbolism is chilling. Her body bound to the one she had betrayed, her every breath steeped in decay. By the time the chains were removed, madness had claimed her. She wandered the coastlines speaking to ghosts until her death. To the Vikings, this was justice, a punishment that let her soul decay before her flesh did. Even mercy, when offered, carried the mark of cruelty. Some women were allowed to take their own lives rather than face public execution. To die by one's own hand was seen as an act of courage, preserving a shred of dignity in the eyes of the gods. But even in death, their bodies were rarely buried with honor. The graves of executed women were shallow, their names left unspoken, their memories swallowed by earth and snow. Oblivion was the final punishment, complete erasure from the songs and sagas that gave immortality. And yet, echoes of these women survived. In the sagas, in the old poems, their names flicker briefly like embers in the dark. Mistresses of forbidden power, bearers of knowledge that terrified men. Their suffering became myth, their deaths transformed into moral lessons whispered across generations. The Vikings believed they had silenced them, but in truth, they had made them immortal. The story of Viking women's punishment is not just a tale of cruelty. It is a reflection of humanity's oldest fear, the fear of the feminine divine. The Norse gods themselves could not escape this fear, for even Odin bowed to the wisdom of the vulva, seeking from her the secrets of fate. And so, in their attempt to destroy these women, the Vikings were really waging war against their own gods, their own origins, their own awe of creation. Through fire, water, rope, and blade, they sought to tame what could not be tamed. And in doing so, they revealed something eternal about themselves, that the true terror of the North was not the axe or the sea, but the woman who dared to wield the power of life in a world that worshipped death. The Norse gods were not merciful beings. They were reflections of the people who worshipped them, fierce, proud, and willing to suffer for meaning. In the Viking mind, the divine was not a distant comforter, but an enduring tormentor. The gods bled, hungered, and screamed just as mortals did. Pain was the proof of devotion, the bridge between man and the infinite. To understand Viking torture, one must first understand their gods, because every lash, every cut, every drop of blood shed in ritual echoed the agonies of the divine. At the heart of this grim theology stood Odin, the All-Father, not a god of mercy, but of sacrifice. The legends tell that Odin sought wisdom above all else, and to gain it, he was willing to suffer as no mortal ever could. He hung himself upon the world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear for 9 nights and 9 days. No food, no drink, no company, only the endless wind and the silence of the void. In that torment, he looked inward and saw the runes, the sacred symbols of knowledge and fate, floating in the darkness. He seized them, earning enlightenment through agony. To the Vikings, this was not madness. It was the highest truth. Wisdom is paid for in blood. That myth became the foundation of their understanding of pain. When they tortured, when they endured, when they watched others die, it was not mere cruelty, it was imitation of the divine. The gods themselves suffered to achieve greatness. Therefore, humans must do the same. In this belief, torment was not degradation, it was elevation. The man who faced agony without fear walked the same path as Odin. To scream was weakness. To endure was transcendence. Pain was not the end of faith. It was its expression. Odin was not alone in divine suffering. Tyr, the god of law and sacrifice, placed his hand into the jaws of the monstrous wolf Fenrir as a pledge of trust, knowing it would cost him dearly. When the trap closed, Fenrir bit through his flesh, severing his arm. Tyr did not cry out. His mutilation was a symbol of loyalty to order, a reminder that justice itself requires blood. Among the Vikings, this story carried immense moral weight. The righteous must pay with their bodies for the world to remain balanced. To lose a limb for truth was not punishment. It was sanctification. Then there was Loki, the trickster, whose endless betrayals led to an eternal punishment that terrified even the gods. Bound by chains forged from the entrails of his son, a venomous serpent dripped poison onto his face, drop by drop. His wife, Sigyn, stayed beside him, catching the venom in a bowl to ease his torment. But when she turned away to empty it, the poison struck his skin, and his screams shook the world. The Vikings saw this as justice divine, a torment that never ended, a mirror of guilt and consequence. Even gods could not escape the moral weight of suffering. These myths were not stories, they were blueprints. The Vikings crafted their rituals to echo these divine torments. When they hung a man from a tree, it was Odin's trial reborn. When they cut off limbs or bound their victims with entrails, it was the punishment of Loki reenacted in flesh. Each act of cruelty carried sacred meaning. To suffer was to participate in the cosmic struggle between gods and chaos. In this way, pain became prayer. Blood was communication. The screams of the dying were offerings to the divine ear. But perhaps the most haunting lesson came from Odin's eye. In another tale, he tore out one of his own eyes and cast it into Mimir's well in exchange for wisdom. The loss of sight gave him vision beyond the physical. It granted him knowledge of fate itself. The Vikings often reference this myth when speaking of sacrifice. To gain power, one must surrender something vital. In their rituals, the removal of body parts, the eyes, the tongue, the hand, was not random sadism. It was symbolic imitation. To take from the body was to open the spirit. The more one lost, the closer one came to divine understanding. The gods in Viking thought were not immortal in the way later religions imagined. They could die, bleed, and feel despair. They awaited Ragnarok, the final battle, where even Odin would fall to Fenrir and the world would be consumed in fire. The Norse cosmos was not built on eternal perfection, but on the certainty of death. And because their gods were doomed, so too were they. But in that doom lay beauty. The gods did not flee their fate, they embraced it. They faced the end singing. This was the ultimate lesson. Pain is not to be avoided. It is to be accepted with honor. Viking tortures often reflected this fatalism. The condemned were told their suffering mirrored the gods' own trials. To scream was to reject that divine connection. To endure was to prove one's kinship with the divine. Some rituals even included priests chanting verses from the Havamal, Odin's wisdom poem, as the victim died. The air would fill with words like, cattle die, kin die, all men are mortal. But one thing never dies, the fame of a dead man's deeds. These were not empty phrases. They were a commandment. Face pain without fear, and your name will live forever. The cults dedicated to Odin and other gods practiced forms of ecstatic pain as worship. Warriors known as berserkers believed they channeled divine fury by entering trance-like states before battle, biting their shields, and cutting their own skin to invoke Odin's strength. Pain was the threshold they crossed to become something more than human, something divine. Bloodletting, self-wounding, and ritual exhaustion were not seen as madness but communion. Each cut brought them closer to the All-Father's madness, the divine insanity that birthed wisdom and victory alike. Even in death, the gods demanded imitation. Those who died in battle were promised Valhalla, a paradise not of peace, but of endless combat. Warriors fought and died every day, only to rise again by nightfall and feast until the dawn of the next slaughter. Eternal pain was their reward. This belief reveals everything about the Viking view of existence. Even in paradise, suffering had meaning. It was not the absence of pain that defined heaven. It was the glory of enduring it forever. To the modern eye, this seems monstrous, but to the Vikings, it was sacred symmetry. Life was struggle, and pain was proof of worth. Their gods did not shield them from torment. They shared it. In that shared suffering, humans found purpose. To die in agony was not tragedy, it was triumph. Imagine a Viking execution through this lens. The condemned kneels beneath a gray sky, surrounded by priests chanting the names of Odin and Tyr. The wind howls through the fjord like an ancient song. His hands are bound, his body trembling not with fear but anticipation. As the blade rises, he looks to the heavens, not pleading for mercy, but acceptance. He believes, truly, that his agony is sacred, that his death is a mirror of the gods. And when the steel falls, he does not die alone. His pain joins the eternal suffering of the divine. In the end, the Norse gods did not teach their followers to avoid pain. They taught them to understand it, to revere it, to use it as a ladder toward eternity. Every scar, every scream, every drop of bloodshed in ritual or punishment was a step on that ladder. The gods had bled first, mortals merely followed. And in that following lay the essence of the Viking soul, a soul that found holiness not in comfort, but in the sacred fire of agony. By the time the Viking age reached its twilight, cruelty was no longer just a practice. It was an identity. The North had become a crucible of belief, one where pain was not a symptom of corruption, but a sign of purity. For centuries, the Norse had learned that life itself was a battle, against nature, against enemies, against fate. Out of that struggle, a terrifying philosophy emerged, one that fused violence with virtue and suffering with sanctity. This was the age when mercy began to die and cruelty became honor. In Viking society, pain was not simply inflicted, it was earned. To suffer was to prove your worth to gods and kin alike. The idea of honor through agony was so deeply embedded that even victims of torture sometimes accepted their fate with grim pride. The condemned man knew that his endurance was a final offering to his ancestors. To scream or beg was to shame not only himself, but his bloodline. And so, many met their end in silence, eyes fixed on the horizon, seeking to turn horror into a kind of redemption. The executioner was not seen as a monster, but as a priest of purification, his blade a bridge between dishonor and the divine. Cruelty was institutional, not impulsive. The Vikings crafted elaborate rituals around punishment, ensuring that each act of pain carried meaning. The infliction of suffering was never random. It was ordered, deliberate, and bound by sacred law. In a world governed by the principle of WIRD, fate woven by unseen hands, every scream, every cut, every drop of blood had a purpose. It was part of the cosmic pattern, just as much as the rising sun or the breaking wave. To interfere with that pattern, to show mercy, was to challenge the gods themselves. This is what made Viking cruelty so terrifying. It was not born of rage, but of conviction. The man who swung the axe or tightened the rope did so with calm devotion, believing he was restoring balance to the world. In their eyes, compassion was weakness, mercy disrupted order. To spare the guilty was to dishonor the ancestors who had bled to preserve justice. Their gods had never been merciful. Why, then, should men be? Over time, this belief system hardened into ritual. Torture became not only a punishment, but a language, a way for society to speak to itself about sin, courage, and cosmic debt. To witness torture was to participate in communal purification. Villagers stood in solemn silence, not cheering, but affirming. Children were brought to see the condemned, to learn the cost of cowardice and betrayal. It was education through terror, a morality written in screams. The public square became both temple and theater, where suffering was worship and death was art. And yet, beneath that rigid belief in divine cruelty, there was a quieter, darker truth. The Vikings were not immune to the psychological weight of what they practiced. The sagas tell of executioners who dreamed of the faces of those they killed, of chieftains haunted by the cries of the dying. They justified their actions through faith, but deep within, they knew that each act of torture carved something away from their own humanity. It was the paradox at the heart of Viking cruelty. They believed pain purified, but it also consumed. There were moments when even the hardest warriors faltered. After battle, when the mead hall quieted and the songs of victory faded, some men would stare into the flames and remember the eyes of those they had punished. They wondered if the gods truly demanded so much blood. But no man could voice such doubts aloud. To question cruelty was to question the order of the world. And so they drank, sang, and buried their unease beneath ritual and myth. The death of mercy was not a sudden event. It was a slow suffocation buried beneath centuries of faith and fear. The sagas themselves, though written centuries later, carry whispers of regret. They glorify courage, but also linger on suffering. They describe men who die bravely, yes, but they also describe those who endure agony so profound that the earth itself seems to shudder. These stories were warnings and confessions at once. The Vikings were proud of their strength, but somewhere in their collective memory, they knew what it had cost them. Every culture that glorifies pain eventually becomes enslaved by it. The psychological framework of Viking cruelty reveals something universal about humanity. When a society makes suffering sacred, it loses the ability to empathize. The Vikings believed that the gods rewarded pain, so they built their entire moral system around it. But once cruelty becomes virtue, there can be no end to it. Each act demands another, more elaborate, more justified. In the end, the line between justice and sadism dissolves completely. For the Vikings, this transformation was slow but inevitable. Torture evolved from necessity into ceremony, from punishment into prayer. It is easy, from a modern perspective, to see the Vikings as monsters. But they were not mindless butchers. They were believers. Their cruelty was intelligent, structured, and meaningful. That is what makes it so haunting. The greatest horrors in history have rarely come from chaos. They come from conviction. The Vikings did not torture because they loved pain. They tortured because they believed pain held truth. It was their theology, their science, their art form. In their world, suffering was not a symptom of evil. It was evidence of divine order. Imagine a cold morning in a Viking village. A condemned man is tied to a post, surrounded by his kin. The air smells of salt and smoke. The chieftain steps forward, solemn, his eyes like frozen stone. He recites the ancient words of judgment, not hatred, but inevitability. The axe descends, the crowd does not cheer, and the silence that follows is heavy with something almost holy. For them, this is not brutality, it is balance. Justice has been done. The gods have been satisfied. But in that silence lies the shadow of something deeper, a flicker of doubt, a question that no one dares to speak. What if the gods are not watching? What if the pain means nothing? That thought, the death of meaning, is the final forbidden terror. For a people who built their faith upon suffering, the possibility that pain might be pointless was the most unbearable idea of all. And yet, as Christianity began to creep into the North, that very question grew louder. The new faith spoke of forgiveness, mercy, and salvation through compassion. To the Vikings, it was incomprehensible. Mercy was weakness. Forgiveness was folly. But in the centuries that followed, the old ways began to fade. The blood-stained altars were abandoned, the cries of the condemned replaced by the quiet hymns of foreign priests. The gods of pain fell silent, and in their silence, a strange new idea took root. Perhaps strength was not proven by how much one could endure, but by how much one could forgive. Still, the legacy of that age endures. The Norse obsession with suffering left a mark that never fully vanished. It lingers in the stories we tell, in the fascination we feel when we confront their cruelty. We look back not because we admire it, but because it forces us to see a reflection of ourselves. Beneath the blood and fire, the Viking soul whispers a question we still cannot escape. Why do humans need pain to feel alive? For the Vikings, cruelty was not merely a shadow. It was their light, the flame that guided them through the cold darkness of their world. And in that fire, they found meaning, order, and transcendence. But when mercy died, something in them died too. What remained was strength, yes, but also emptiness. The echo of screams became their only prayer, and through it, they built eternity. When the Viking Age came to an end, it did not vanish in fire or conquest. It faded quietly, like a dying ember swallowed by the northern snow. The great ships rotted in their harbors, the longhouses fell silent, and the gods of pain drifted into myth. Yet even as centuries passed, something of their spirit endured. The belief that pain could reveal truth, that suffering was not only punishment but purification, never truly died. It changed its shape, hid behind new symbols, and found new languages to speak through. The Vikings had once seen agony as sacred, the body as a vessel through which the soul could prove its worth. When Christianity spread across the North, it did not erase that idea. It merely transformed it. The saints and martyrs of the new faith bled where Odin once hung, their suffering praised as holy endurance. The Norse world had not abandoned the worship of pain. It had simply baptized it. The cross replaced the hammer, but the blood remained. And yet, time softened the edges of that brutality. The rituals of fire, ice, and rope gave way to prayer, reflection, and guilt. The echo of screams became memory, and the people who once found holiness in torment began to wonder whether mercy might be the truer strength. The sagas, preserved by monks and poets, remembered the violence but also mourned it. Beneath their tales of valor lies an unspoken sadness, a recognition that pain, once revered, had consumed too much of the human soul. Still, their legacy lingers in us. The fascination with their cruelty, the reverence for their courage, the awe of their faith in suffering, all survive in the modern imagination. We still tell stories of warriors who endure, of heroes who suffer to become whole. We still believe that meaning demands pain, that greatness requires sacrifice. The Vikings may have fallen, But the questions they carved into the bones of history remain. Why does humanity still glorify suffering? And what does it say about us that we cannot look away? Perhaps that is their true gift and their warning. The Vikings remind us that when pain becomes divine, mercy dies. Their gods demanded endurance, and their people answered with centuries of blood. But in the end, their world collapsed not from weakness, but from exhaustion. The endless worship of suffering had hollowed it out. All that remained was silence, the kind that follows after the last cry has faded. And yet, in that silence, something still breathes. The memory of their courage, their defiance, their belief that pain could reach the divine. It is a mirror held up to every age that seeks meaning in the dark. The Vikings are gone, but the truth they chase still haunts us, that in every heart there is a hunger to suffer for something greater, and a hope that, somehow, the gods are still listening.